Welcome back. The Competition Commission is now holding what it calls the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry. It's looking at how the big tech companies like X and Google and Facebook are making money through advertising at the expense of the companies that produce news content. This week, the SA National Editors Forum told the inquiry tech companies are using content produced by news producers and are able to place adverts around that content. They get the revenue from that advertising. The people who produce the content get nothing for it. William Bird is Director of Media Monitoring Africa. William, good afternoon to you. What impact do you believe this situation is having on the media in our country?
I mean, the shift to digital has been catastrophic for many of the media and news organizations' business models. This isn't unique to South Africa. We've seen globally a huge decline in the number of journalists. We see in South Africa increasingly fewer and fewer journalists in newsrooms. Obviously, some of that's got to do with, a difficult economy, etc. But certainly one of the largest contributing factors to the decline of the number of journalists and to their business model has been the fact that these social media companies, these giants have come in, they've introduced a far better model, let's be clear, but that they haven't been paying anything close to fair compensation for the content that they've been taking and using and on which they've built their need and on which they've made themselves into multi-billion or trillion-dollar entities.
It would seem that what could have happened is when the internet sort of got going in the 1990s, many towns and cities and some villages would have had local newspapers, and those local newspapers would have produced a lot of local news. And what could have happened is that they could all have just gone online. So it wouldn't have been that the advertising would change or that the model would change. You would just read it online rather than read it off printed paper. Why did that not happen and this model of big tech companies happen instead?
So, I mean, it did to a degree, but the major roadblock to that, of course, is that local news organizations going online requires another huge investment. And the value that you get from digital advertising is simply not there. To take out a page in a local community newspaper, they have to make a real and meaningful contribution, in the order of like 10,000 Rand or something. Whereas if you do digital advertising, you're talking about maybe a couple of Rand for an advert. And those economies just don't work. So you've tended to find that some of those small ones still produce locally newspapers, but of course many of their audiences, even with digital access being very expensive in South Africa, many of their audiences have migrated online. So they put in this very difficult role where they have to be both local in order to produce a print thing to be sustainable, but also be online in order to try and be where their audiences are going and where they are shifting. So particularly small media are caught between a rock and a hard place, but we're seeing that impact all of our media across the sector, whether they're broadcasters, whether they are small commercial print, or whether they are, the traditional larger newspaper models. All of them have been hit by this fact that the entire digital advertising model favors the social media giants, and the money that they get from the value that they get is just not commensurate with what news media need and are offering to the public.
So does this mean that there's less news being produced? It's not that there's less news happening. I think there's probably more news happening now than happened 10 years ago. But there's less journalism about that news.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the real tragedy, especially in a country like South Africa where we're still getting to grips with what a democracy means, understanding how democracy functions. You need more journalists explaining the complexity of our country. Your stories that you were detailing earlier, you need journalists there on the ground to explain, to understand all of these things. But when you've got a newsroom with only 5 journalists or 3 journalists, and you're deciding to go there, it means that you're necessarily missing out on a range of other stories that may on many levels be equally important for people to hear. So this is not just bad for news organizations and news media. This is fundamentally bad and poses a catastrophic risk, frankly, for democracy.
Do we know how much money the tech companies are making from this? And as I understand it, they don't report their profits in South Africa, they report them in Ireland.
it's not just their profits, of course, because every now and then you see those things. But what we don't know and what we're not clear on is how much money they make, what their economic model is in South Africa. So you don't know how much they're paying for things. You don't know on what their scales are. The level of transparency there, frankly, is more cloudy than Durban Beach after a massive flood. You just aren't getting anything close to what we need for transparency, for people to actually have a fair understanding of how things work, of what they can and should be paid, and what may be a reasonable expectation. So you've got news organizations saying we need to be paid for the value that we are bringing. The big tech saying, well, we can offer you this, and them actually having no idea whether what they're offering is a legitimate basis or whether it's something that's completely cloud in the sky.
What should be the remedy for this? So there's this inquiry. The Competition Commission has certain jurisdiction. X, unfortunately, is not taking part in this commission at all. Elon Musk has said no. Google's made, I think, a written submission. I think the same for Meta. They may make verbal submissions later. What can the Competition Commission really do to improve the situation that you've described?
Well, I think they can, and hopefully they will do a number of things. I think just on X, the thing that people should appreciate about that is that here you've got a company that's operating in South Africa, making money in South Africa, yet is offering no single, not even the teeniest bit of accountability to South Africa. You can imagine any other service provider that comes in with a product that then offers no backup, no supports, no guarantee, and no form of accountability, in a heartbeat, they would no longer be allowed to operate. So the fact that X is deciding not to participate, I think, is beyond disgraceful. It shows a contempt for South Africa and a contempt for the continent. In terms of what can be done, there are some really interesting ideas coming from around the world in terms of making sure that there are agreements. In Australia, they've done them there. They've done some in Indonesia recently to get big tech to pay for the content that they are using. And I think more importantly, though, beyond just that basic payment, is recognition of the critical importance that credible, accurate, and reliable information plays in sustaining not just democracy, but in sustaining a viable society. Because as we're seeing the rise of AI, and as anyone can find anything on whatever social media platform, the role and importance of knowing, okay, this is actually real and this isn't. This is actually true and this isn't. That is going to be increasingly fundamental to people being able to make decisions about, do I drive into work today or not? Because I've seen a video that says that there's a massive riot just next door, when in fact there may well not be one. So being able to know how to operate is important. So recognizing the principle of the importance of news, of journalism, is going to be one of the most important things that I think the Competition Commission can do. And then it's about starting to say, well, what is this worth to the social media platforms, and what is it worth to society? And how do we also then start to say, well, you've made all this money. You also need to compensate us for the years that you've been operating where you haven't paid us even anything close to fair compensation.
William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. Thank you. Really appreciate the time.